They possessed world-class vocal talents, complex and moving harmonies that rivaled or even surpassed the most famous stars of the time. Yet, instead of basking in the bright lights of the stage, the Spinners were handed a set of car keys by Motown executives and ordered to drive established stars to concerts. Why did America's most powerful music empire deliberately freeze the youth of these musical geniuses for nearly a decade, turning them into invisible servants in their own home? History often romanticizes the era of soul music as a time of magical, spontaneous creation, where raw talent was instantly recognized and rewarded. But the issue is not what the public saw on television. The issue is how the system functioned behind locked doors. Many music historians and industry insiders have long noted that the Motown empire was not built on magic. It was built identically to the Detroit automotive plants that surrounded it. It was a ruthless, highly efficient, and unapologetically rigid assembly line. The founder, Berry Gordy, had previously worked at a Lincoln Mercury plant, and he applied the exact same principles of mass production to human beings. You brought in raw materials, young, hungry teenagers, from the housing projects of Detroit, and you ran them through a mechanized process of development, styling, and recording until a shiny, commercially viable product rolled off the line. But history rarely talks about the scrap heap. It rarely talks about the inventory that was deliberately kept in the warehouse. When the Spinners, Bobby Smith, Purvis Jackson, Billy Henderson, Henry Fambrough, and initially C.P. Spencer were signed to the label in the early 1960s, they thought they had won the lottery. They were local legends in the Detroit area, young men who had spent their adolescence perfecting intricate 5-part harmonies in high school bathrooms and on street corners. They had the raw talent, the drive, and the ambition. However, the moment the ink dried on their contracts, they were systematically stripped of their autonomy. The label did not place them on its premier imprint alongside its marquee stars. Instead, they were shunted onto a subsidiary label named VIP Records. The name itself was a dark psychological joke. Despite the glamorous implication of being a very important person, archival records and testimonies from the era indicate that VIP Records functioned essentially as a holding cell. It was the minor leagues, a secondary tier where acts were systematically starved of promotional resources, marketing budgets, and crucial radio airplay. Some biographers suggest that the system never intended to make them global superstars. Rather, signing them was a strategic containment move. By locking them into exclusive long-term contracts, the label ensured that rival record companies could not acquire and weaponize their incredible vocal talents against the Motown empire. They were neutralized before they even stepped into the vocal booth. The true gatekeepers of the empire orchestrated this relegation to the basement. The artists did not decide what music the public heard. The producers did not have final say. Absolute power resided in a windowless room during the Friday morning quality control meetings. This was the ultimate inspection line. Every week, the label's top executives, writers, and producers gathered to listen to the tracks recorded that week. The process was brutal and entirely devoid of sentimentality. They evaluated songs based on a strict mathematical formula of pop crossover appeal. The mandate was to create the sound of young America, a highly polished, sanitized, and universally digestible sound that would appeal to white, suburban teenagers as much as it did to black audiences in the inner cities. If a track did not perfectly align with this rigid sonic geometry, it was mercilessly voted down and permanently shelved in the vault. For the spinners, the gatekeepers constantly said no. Their sound was slightly older, a bit more rooted in traditional rhythm and blues, and carried a deeper gospel texture that the executives deemed too risky for immediate mass consumption. They were consistently outvoted, not because they lacked brilliance, but because they did not fit the immediate commercial quota of the week. But while their music was locked away, the financial clock was always ticking. The mechanism that truly enslaved the spinners was a highly contested, deeply exploitative industry practice known as recoupment. In the modern era, an employee is paid a salary for their time. In the 1960s record industry, the artist paid the company for the privilege of working. Every single expense incurred by the group was tracked and added to a massive invisible ledger. When they used the studio to record a demo, even one that the quality control department would later reject, they were charged for the studio time. They were charged for the session musicians. They were charged for the audio engineers. They were even charged for their own meager living stipends and the stage uniforms they rarely got to wear. The system was brilliantly, diabolically rigged. Because the gatekeepers refused to release their records or push them to radio stations, the spinners could not generate the royalty income required to pay off this artificially inflated debt. They were sinking into a financial abyss, trapped in a cycle of debt peonage, carefully engineered by the very institution that claimed to be nurturing them. The debt demanded payment. The record label was not a charity, and they expected to extract value from every asset on their roster, whether that asset was singing on a television special or sweeping the floor. To survive, to keep food on the table for their families, and to maintain their restrictive contracts in the desperate hope that one day a song would slip through the gates, the spinners were forced into manual labor. The executives handed them work schedules instead of tour itineraries. The transition was abrupt and devastating. Bobby Smith, a co-lead tenor who possessed a soaring golden voice that could melt stone and command any arena in the country, was handed a chauffeur's cap. He was ordered to act as a personal driver for the Temptations, a group he knew he could vocally match note for note. Purvis Jackson, the group's anchoring bass whose deep resonant tones were the bedrock of their harmony, found himself wearing thick work gloves, hauling boxes of promotional materials and vinyl records in the shipping department. Billy Henderson and Henry Fambro were assigned tasks as roadies, security guards, and chaperones for the label's female artists. They became the background machinery that kept the glamour of the A-list stars running smoothly. The fatal weakness of the spinners, the tragic flaw that kept them anchored to this abuse, was their deeply conditioned sense of institutional loyalty and their working-class, Midwestern humility. Coming from neighborhoods where the only alternative was the grueling, dangerous labor of the actual auto plants or being drafted into the military, they viewed the record label as a patriarchal sanctuary. To walk away from Berry Gordy's empire was widely considered career suicide in Detroit. They operated under the naive, honorable belief in a meritocracy that simply did not exist. They believed that if they just played by the rules, kept their heads down, swept the floors cleaner, drove the cars smoother, and sang their background harmonies perfectly. The executives would eventually recognize their dedication and reward them with the spotlight. They trusted a system that viewed them not as human beings with artistic souls, but as depreciating assets on a balance sheet. The machine actively exploited this loyalty, using their compliance to maintain a cheap, reliable labor force while simultaneously keeping a potential competitor off the billboard charts. The physical labor, the heavy lifting, and the long hours driving limousines through the night were exhausting, but the physical toll was not the core of their trauma. The true horror was the absolute soul-crushing humiliation. Imagine the agonizing gap between what they knew they were capable of and the reality they were forced to live. They experienced the daily grinding indignity of standing in the wings of a theater, their tailored suits replaced by cheap uniforms, listening to a rival group perform. They would hear a vocal run or a harmony structure that they themselves had perfected years earlier, knowing with absolute certainty that they could execute it better, with more emotion and precision. Yet, they had to swallow their pride, bury their ambition, and quietly bow their heads to open the car door for those very same stars at the end of the night. It was an environment designed to breed bitterness, yet they were forced to maintain a facade of grateful subservience. They were artists forced to act as the help. The system deliberately stripped away their professional dignity, reducing their magnificent art to a mere hobby permitted only after the warehouse floors were spotless and the executives had gone home. And this is where the architecture of the trap reveals its most insidious layer. Even when they were allowed to step into the studio, their identities were constantly undermined. They were frequently used as uncredited background singers for other, more prominent artists. Their voices, their unique vocal signatures, were blended into the background of massive hits, generating immense wealth for the company and glory for the lead singers, while the spinners remained entirely anonymous. The public heard their brilliance on the radio every day, but had no idea whose voices they were actually listening to. The machine was literally harvesting their talent, extracting the raw material of their harmonies, and selling it under a different brand name. It was a form of artistic erasure that went beyond financial exploitation. It was the theft of their legacy in real time. The label did not just freeze their youth, they actively consumed it to fuel the success of others. As the 1960s progressed and the musical landscape shifted toward a more politically conscious sound, time stood still for the spinners. Approaching their 30s, their prime performing years were being consumed by menial labor and uncredited background vocals. They were physically inside the most famous hit-making machine in the world, yet financially and artistically isolated from its success. The Motown machine assumed this decade of subservience had successfully institutionalized them. However, the system had a blind spot. It could control the ledgers and the promoters, but it could not permanently suppress the raw talent operating within its own walls. By the late 1960s, a young Stevie Wonder was beginning to flex his creative autonomy. Unlike the rank-and-file artists who were strictly bound by the Friday morning quality control meetings, Wonder was rapidly becoming an unstoppable force, a prodigy who possessed the leverage to bypass the standard assembly line. He was roaming the corridors of the hit factory, listening, observing and actively looking for the right vessel to carry a specific sound he had been developing. He did not look toward the A-list roster. He looked toward the warehouse. Wonder had heard the raw, unfiltered vocal power of the Spinners, specifically the gritty, impassioned lead vocals of G.C. Cameron, a relatively new addition who had replaced original member Edgar Edwards. Wonder recognized immediately that the group's marginalized status was a catastrophic waste of human capital. He walked into the studio with them, bypassing the usual bureaucratic gatekeepers, and handed them a track he had co-written with Syreeta Wright and Lee Garrett. That track was It's a Shame. When the song was released in 1970, it did not just climb the charts, it detonated. The track was a masterpiece of driving rhythm and soaring melancholic harmonies, anchored by Cameron's desperate, pleading lead vocal. It resonated universally, crashing into the top 20 of the Billboard Hot 100 and becoming a massive international success, particularly in Britain. The Spinners were suddenly everywhere. They were performing on television, their voices were blasting from car radios across the country, and the public looked at them with the awe reserved for newly minted millionaires. The visual contradiction of this era is staggering. Picture the five men standing under the bright studio lights of national television programs, wearing the sharp, coordinated suits of successful soul stars, projecting an image of absolute triumph. They were smiling, hitting every synchronized dance step, and basking in the adoration of millions. Yet, behind those smiles was a terrifying, deeply concealed reality. The gap between how the public perceived them and their actual, lived experience was a chasm. You would naturally assume that a global blockbuster is the ultimate escape velocity from poverty and servitude, but the plot twist of the music industry is that a hit record can sometimes become the heaviest chain of all. This is where the financial mechanics of the industry shift from exploitative to entirely predatory. The public saw a hit song, but the accountants at the record label saw an opportunity to balance their ledgers. Despite generating immense revenue, the royalty distributions remained cloaked in the shadows of their original archaic contracts. The money did not flow directly into the bank accounts of Bobby Smith, Purvis Jackson, or G.C. Cameron. Instead, it was aggressively funneled into a financial black hole known as cross-collateralization. This is an accounting tactic where a label uses the profits of a successful record to pay off the accumulated debts of all the previous, unsuccessful, or unreleased recordings. Remember the decade they spent in the warehouse? Remember the studio time they were charged for when the gatekeepers refused to release their music? All of that artificially inflated debt was waiting for them. The hit song, It's a Shame, functioned as a giant sponge, soaking up millions of dollars from the public, only for the record label to instantly squeeze it dry to pay itself back. Cross-collateralization is essentially like being forced to pay off a massive mortgage on a house you are legally forbidden to live in. The Spinners were staring at a #1 record on the wall and a zero-balance bank account in their hands. They were famous, yet they were still fundamentally broke. The financial reality was stark. Men who had just sung a smash hit to millions of people were still trapped in a cycle of artificial debt. Instead of capitalizing on the group's massive momentum and treating them as top-tier artists, the conservative machinery of the label panicked. The executives viewed them not as autonomous creators who had just proven their undeniable worth, but as a disposable commodity that had unexpectedly yielded a return. They did not want to nurture the spinners. They wanted to control them. The system immediately applied intense pressure to change the group's fundamental identity. The label's strategy was built on the concept of the crossover, the idea that black artists had to be heavily diluted, sanitized, and packaged to avoid offending the sensibilities of the white middle-class market. When It's a Shame hit, the executives intervened. They demanded the spinners strip away the deep, authentic gospel textures that made their harmonies so compelling. They dictated their wardrobe, attempting to force them into a safer, highly engineered mold. It is a psychological torture to finally reach the summit of your profession, only to be told that the very essence of who you are is unacceptable. They were granted a momentary taste of the pinnacle, but the implicit message was clear. You are only allowed to stay here if you stop being yourselves. Furthermore, the label deployed a classic ruthless tactic of corporate containment: divide and conquer. It is a well-documented historical strategy in the recording industry to intentionally fracture the brotherhood of vocal groups. A united group is a threat. A united group can negotiate, demand audits, and leverage their collective power. A divided group is easily manipulated. The executives began to single out G.C. Cameron. They focused the camera lenses on him, pulled him into exclusive meetings, and began whispering the intoxicating promise of a solo career into his ear. They intentionally stoked internal jealousy, creating an environment where the men who had hauled boxes together and driven limousines together were now subtly positioned as competitors. The system was actively trying to break their most vital asset, their solidarity. The physical tension in the rehearsal rooms became palpable. You have 5 men who survived a decade of humiliation by leaning on each other, now being told by the architects of their misery that only one of them is truly valuable. The tragedy of this tactic is that it exploited the very fatal weakness that had kept them trapped for so long. Their psychological need for institutional validation was weaponized against them. G.C. Cameron, possessing a phenomenal voice and natural charisma, was particularly vulnerable to these promises. His situation was further complicated by an intense personal entanglement. Many historians and biographers note that Cameron was romantically involved with Gwen Gordy, the sister of the label's founder, Berry Gordy. This relationship blurred the lines between professional ambition and personal loyalty. The record label was no longer just his employer. It was intimately connected to his private life. The executives promised him that if he stayed loyal to the machine, if he separated himself from the collective weight of the spinners, they would groom him into the next Marvin Gaye or Jackie Wilson. They offered him the spotlight, but the price of admission was abandoning the brothers who had stood beside him in the shadows. By 1971, the atmosphere had become unbearable. The group's punishing decade-long sentence, their original restrictive contract, was finally approaching its expiration date. For the first time in their adult lives, Bobby, Purvis, Billy, Henry, and G.C. possessed actual leverage. They faced a definitive, life-altering intersection. They could sign a new contract with the machine, quietly accepting their permanent status as second-class citizens in exchange for a meager, predictable paycheck. Or they could orchestrate a mass exodus, stepping out into the terrifying unknown of the industry without the backing of the most powerful label in the world. The pressure of this decision weighed heavily on every interaction. The silence in the dressing rooms was deafening. They were men in their late 20s and early 30s, realizing that their youth had been effectively stolen, frozen in a state of suspended animation while other artists built empires. They knew with a terrifying clarity that if they stayed, they would die artistically. They would be squeezed for a few more minor hits, their royalties endlessly redirected to pay off phantom debts until they were eventually discarded and replaced by younger, more compliant models. The decision was made. The spinners chose to walk. They chose to reclaim their dignity, deciding that it was better to risk total failure on their own terms than to guarantee their own erasure within the machine. They packed their bags, leaving behind the only professional home they had ever known. But every escape leaves casualties behind, and the agony of their departure is encapsulated in the fracture of their brotherhood. When the moment came to walk out the door, G.C. Cameron stopped. Tethered by his personal relationship with Gwen Gordy, bound by a separate, highly restrictive contract, and deeply influenced by the institution's glittering promise of solo stardom, Cameron chose not to step into the unknown. He traded the fierce, proven loyalty of his vocal brothers for a corporate promise, a promise that many industry critics argue the label never fully intended to fulfill. The visual of this separation is heartbreaking. Imagine Bobby Smith and Purvis Jackson standing in the Detroit rain, holding their meager belongings, looking back at the polished glass doors of the hit factory, knowing their lead singer, the voice that had finally brought them out of the basement, was staying inside the cage. Yet, in the midst of this profound betrayal and loss, an extraordinary act of grace occurred. Before the doors closed forever, before the legal ties were completely severed, G.C. Cameron committed a final pivotal act of loyalty to the men he was leaving behind. He knew they could not secure a new recording contract without a dynamic frontman. He knew the industry would view them as damaged goods, a group of aging background singers who had lost their primary asset. So, Cameron picked up the phone and made a recommendation. He reached out to his cousin, an eccentric, immensely talented but relatively unknown singer who was working the grueling nightclub circuits. He told the spinners to bring him in for an audition. He handed them the final piece of the puzzle. That single recommendation, that quiet transfer of power in the shadow of a broken contract, was the introduction of Philippe Wynne. By handing them Wynne, Cameron unknowingly armed the spinners with the exact weapon they needed to completely dismantle the empire that had enslaved them. With Philippe Wynne in tow, the remaining members of the spinners were entirely unmoored. They were a legendary vocal group on the streets of Detroit with no label, no manager, and no immediate prospects. They were highly skilled mechanics of sound, but they were locked out of the garage. It was in this desperate, precarious moment that the unseen network of marginalized artists intervened. They did not seek the advice of corporate executives. They sought the counsel of their peers. According to industry lore, they reached out to the undisputed royalty of soul music, Aretha Franklin. Franklin, who had herself navigated the treacherous waters of predatory contracts and artistic suppression earlier in her career, understood exactly what the Spinners possessed and exactly how the industry was trying to suffocate them. She did not offer them sympathy, she offered them a tactical strike. She looked at their immense talent, completely ignored the narrative that Motown had tried to build around them, and pointed them straight toward New York. She told them to sign with Atlantic Records. The transition from Detroit to Atlantic Records was not merely a change of address, it was a shift into an entirely different universe of artistic philosophy. Atlantic was not operating a mechanized assembly line. They were not interested in forcing artists into rigid, prefabricated molds designed by a quality control committee. When the Spinners walked into the Atlantic offices, they were not handed mops and they were not handed car keys. They were handed something they had been denied for their entire adult lives: absolute, uncompromising respect. Atlantic paired the group with an emerging, fiercely intelligent producer named Tom Bell. Bell was a classical virtuoso, a man who understood the architecture of sound on a molecular level. He did not look at the Spinners as background singers or disposable commodities. He looked at them and saw a perfectly tuned 5-cylinder vocal engine. The issue wasn't just that Tom Bell gave them good songs. The issue is how he fundamentally restructured their recording process. Bell recognized that the Detroit machine had deliberately suppressed the unique individual textures of their voices to create a homogeneous wall of sound. He immediately dismantled that approach. He brought them into the Sigma Sound Studios in Philadelphia, a facility that would soon become legendary, and he began to tailor the music specifically to the unique emotional frequency of each member. He utilized Bobby Smith's smooth, heartbreaking tenor for the intricate melodies. He utilized Purvis Jackson's booming subterranean bass not just as background filler, but as a lead instrument, a rhythmic anchor that gave their tracks an undeniable sophisticated groove. And he recognized the wild improvisational genius of their new frontman, Philippe Wynne. Wynne possessed a voice that was unpredictable, deeply rooted in the chaotic energy of the Pentecostal church, capable of shifting from a smooth croon to an agonizing, ecstatic wail in a fraction of a second. Tom Bell did not try to sanitize Wynne. He built massive, sweeping orchestral arrangements designed specifically to let Wynne's voice run wild. The result of this collaboration was not just a comeback, it was a total, unprecedented annihilation of the charts. In 1972, they released I'll Be Around, a track so flawlessly constructed, so emotionally resonant and structurally perfect, that it immediately became an anthem. It was followed in rapid succession by Could It Be I'm Falling in Love, One of a Kind, Love Affair, and Mighty Love. These were not just hit records, they were cultural monuments. They became the undisputed architects and kings of the Philadelphia soul movement. The music was lush, expansive, and incredibly sophisticated, featuring sweeping string sections, driving horns, and vocal arrangements that were mathematically complex yet deeply human. They were selling millions of records, completely dominating the radio frequencies across the globe. But the true, intoxicating poetry of their success was not the money or the fame. The ultimate vindication was looking at the Billboard charts and seeing their names utterly crushing the sales figures of the very Detroit executives who had once treated them as lackeys. The artists who were once deemed unworthy of a release date were now the most profitable vocal group in the world, while the machine that had imprisoned them was slowly beginning to fracture under its own rigid weight. The year is 1973, and the architecture of the American music industry is undergoing a seismic, irreversible shift. The Detroit hit factory, once an impenetrable fortress of pop dominance, is beginning to pack up its operations. The executives are orchestrating a massive corporate migration to Los Angeles, leaving behind the hollowed-out concrete shells of their former glory, abandoning the very city and the very working-class neighborhoods that had provided the raw material for their global empire. Meanwhile, a few states away in Pennsylvania, the men they threw into the basement are actively, relentlessly rewriting the sonic landscape of the globe. The spinners are no longer standing in the shadows of a loading dock. They are entirely dominating the Billboard charts. The poetic justice of this historical moment is profound and deeply satisfying. The executives who sat in the windowless quality control room, who arrogantly voted down their tracks and handed them work uniforms, are now watching their own market share evaporate. They are losing the cultural war, and they are losing it to the very shipping clerks, janitors, and chauffeurs they had systematically humiliated for a decade. The system did not fail to recognize the talent of the spinners. It deliberately chose to suppress it, because true independent genius is a fundamental threat to a corporate monopoly. But once the cage was broken, the sheer velocity of their ascent was terrifying to the old guard. They were releasing masterpiece after masterpiece, Mighty Love, Games People Play, The Rubber Band Man, stacking up gold records and headlining international tours. The physical manifestation of their new autonomy was absolute. They were no longer driving the cars. They were owning the stage. Their tailored suits no longer a costume worn for someone else's benefit, but the armor of their own undisputed sovereignty. The devastating cost of their victory lay with the man left behind. G.C. Cameron stayed loyal to the machine. He trusted the corporate promise of solo superstardom. He believed the executives when they whispered that he was the singular talent, the chosen one who did not need the collective weight of the brotherhood. But the system is inherently parasitic, and its promises are entirely conditional. Once the label relocated to California, the corporate priorities drastically shifted. The massive promotional budgets were funneled into film production and reserved for a select handful of untouchable megastars like Diana Ross and Marvin Gaye. Cameron was left completely stranded in the mid-tier roster. He released critically acclaimed, beautifully sung material, but the coordinated, overwhelming marketing machine that had been promised to him never materialized. He became a living, breathing cautionary tale of institutional loyalty. The psychological weight of his reality is agonizing to contemplate. He sat in a modest apartment in Los Angeles, bound by an ironclad contract, turning on the television to watch his former bandmates, the men he used to haul equipment with, accepting Grammy nominations and performing for millions. A creeping cold realization set in. He had traded his freedom for a corporate lie. He watched his cousin, Felipe Wynne, the man he had personally recommended for the job, ascend to the absolute zenith of the industry, while he remained trapped in a legal apparatus that slowly suffocated his prime recording years. The gap between what the institution promised Cameron and what they actually delivered is the ultimate tragedy of the corporate artist. He was an exceptional talent isolated within a corporate roster that heavily prioritized its megastars. But escaping one oppressive label does not mean escaping the overarching predatory machinery of American entertainment. The Spinners had achieved massive financial and critical success at Atlantic, but the broader music industry immediately began the insidious process of cultural whitening and historical erasure. Tom Bell and the Spinners had painstakingly constructed the intricate symphonic blueprint of Philadelphia soul. They introduced the driving, sophisticated four-on-the-floor beat, the sweeping cinematic orchestral strings, and the complex interlocking vocal harmonies that flawlessly bridge the gap between raw gospel emotion and the polished dance floor. It was a black cultural innovation of the highest order, yet within a few short years, the predominantly white corporate music structure recognized the immense profitability of this sound. The industry took that exact blueprint, meticulously stripped it of its deep black cultural origins, rebranded it under the sanitized, universally marketable label of disco, and handed the global crown to acts like the Bee Gees. The creators of the sound were slowly, deliberately pushed to the margins of the historical narrative. The industry establishment celebrates the imitators while actively forgetting the architects. The Spinners created the vocal harmony structures that would later be commodified by countless pop acts and boy bands in the decades to follow. Yet they are routinely left out of mainstream historical retrospectives. The machine allows you to build the house, it allows you to lay the foundation and wire the electricity, but it rarely lets you hold the deed. It is a calculated erasure, reducing brilliant pioneers to mere footnotes or nostalgia acts, while elevating those who package the pioneers' labor into a safer, more digestible commodity for the masses. This is the ultimate theft. They escaped the physical warehouse in Detroit, but they found themselves fighting against an invisible systemic warehouse designed to rewrite history in favor of the controllable and the safe. Even within their own fiercely protected ranks, the venom of the industry eventually found a way in. The deepest tragedy of the Spinners is that the very mechanism that saved them, the introduction of Philippe Wynne, eventually became the catalyst for their most devastating internal fracture. The music press and the new era of industry handlers could not comprehend or simply refuse to respect the concept of a true collective. The capitalist model of American stardom fundamentally demands a singular icon. It needs a single face to put on the magazine cover, a single ego to flatter and manipulate. The media began to aggressively single out Wynne. They praised his chaotic, electrifying stage presence, his unpredictable vocal runs, and his flamboyant personality, while subtly and consistently downplaying the foundational anchoring architecture provided by Bobby Smith, Purvis Jackson, Henry Fambrough, and Billy Henderson. The old divide and conquer tactic, which they had successfully recognized and escaped in Detroit, was now being executed flawlessly by the press and their own management apparatus. The psychological pressure was immense. Egos flared under the intense heat of global fame. Resentments that had been buried under the initial euphoria of their Atlantic success began to violently surface. Wynne, fueled by the intoxicating, relentless whisper of critics telling him he was the sole reason for the group's resurgence, began to demand top billing. He wanted the marquee to separate him from the men who had built the platform he was standing on. When the collective, hardened by a decade of exploitation, flatly refused to bow to the demands of an individual ego, the brotherhood irrevocably broke. Wynn departed the group in 1977 to launch a highly publicized solo career. It was a move celebrated by industry executives who finally had their singular controllable star. However, the tragic irony of his departure was immediate and severe. Wynn's solo career never captured the magnificent lightning-in-a-bottle magic of the collective. He had the voice, but he lacked the intricate, stabilizing harmonic safety net that Bobby, Purvis, Henry, and Billy had always provided. Without the tight, disciplined structure of the group behind him, his erratic brilliance lacked a foundation. His career floundered, and he spent the next several years chasing the ghost of his former glory, collaborating with George Clinton's Parliament Funkadelic, but never reclaiming the throne he had abandoned. The ultimate tragedy of this fracture culminated in 1984. Philippe Wynne, the man who had helped orchestrate the greatest escape in music history, suffered a massive heart attack and collapsed on a nightclub stage in Oakland, California. He died the following day. He was entirely disconnected from the brothers who had once lifted him up, dying in the relentless pursuit of a solo spotlight that the industry had falsely promised would sustain him. The machine always extracts a toll, even years after you think you have beaten it. It feeds on division, and it leaves its brightest stars to burn out in isolation. As the decades rolled on into the new millennium, the physical toll of their extraordinary, grueling journey began to systematically claim the founding members. The men who had survived the harshest conditions the music industry could manufacture were eventually forced to surrender to time. Purvis Jackson, the anchoring bass whose deep, resonant voice had once echoed off the concrete walls of the Detroit shipping department, passed away in 2008. Bobby Smith, the golden tenor whose voice defined a generation but who was forced to wear a chauffeur's cap, succumbed to illness in 2013. Billy Henderson, the spiritual and energetic core of their live performances, faced a heartbreakingly cruel end. In his twilight years, he was dismissed from the group he helped found over a tragic, bitter financial dispute, with their management dying shortly after, in 2007, isolated from his life's work. Henry Fambro stood alone as the last surviving original member, quietly and stoically carrying the immense weight of their collective memory, defending their legacy until his own passing in early 2024. They aged, they suffered, and they died. But while their physical bodies deteriorated, the verdict on their lives had already been permanently, unalterably sealed. They did not die as shipping clerks. They did not fade away as background singers. They did not allow the executives in the quality control room to write the final chapter of their existence. They forced the world to acknowledge their sovereignty. In late 2023, the industry establishment that had once tried to bury them, the very system that had attempted to erase their contributions and replace them with safer alternatives, was finally forced to bow. The Spinners were officially inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was an institutional apology delayed by half a century, a reluctant admission by the power structure that they could no longer ignore the architects of the sound. The legendary R&B group New Edition, who performed their tribute at the induction, accurately described their massive impact. But the true victory was not the trophy. The true victory was the undeniable historical record they left behind. The story of the Spinners is a direct case study of labor, power, and survival in the music industry. The Motown system was designed to commodify their talent and extract their prime years, treating them as replaceable assets on an assembly line. The machine utilized restrictive contracts, uncredited labor, and internal division to maintain control. Yet corporate mandates could not manufacture their complex harmonies or permanently suppress their drive. They broke away from the factory model and became the architects of Philadelphia soul, a sound that defined an era. Today, the executives who dictated their schedules are footnotes in corporate history, while the vocal blueprint the Spinners built remains a foundational pillar of modern R&B.